First of all, I have to say, unlike my colleagues here, I went to school in England. And I did my PhD in sociology. And it was impossible to come out without being a Marxist. Impossible. Right? You would have to have not read anything that was on the syllabus not to be a Marxist. So this was a completely different thing. But what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk more about the role that Marx played in developing radical feminism. And I'm going to talk about how we got from liberation to empowerment and empowerment to liberation in just one real generation. So let's talk about putting the radical back in feminism. Do you remember what feminism used to be? Let me just remind you. This is by Ruth Blair. By patriarchy, I mean the historic system of male dominance. A system, whoever uses the word system anymore, committed to the maintenance and reinforcement of male hegemony. Its institutions direct and protect the distribution of power and privilege to those who are male, apportioned, however, according to social and economic race and class. In here is Marx applied to feminism. And what I'm going to argue is that it was the taking Marx and his structural analysis that put teeth in feminism, and it is the neoliberal destruction of feminism that has defanged feminism today. So radical feminism had a structural view of equal equality, owing much to what it borrowed from Marxism. Now, let's go and have a look what that means today. The mainstream feminism, third wave it's often referred to, is more an individualistic view that celebrates free choice, agency, and empowerment. And if anyone ever talks about the fact that feminism was about choice, no, it was never about choice. It was about dismantling the structures of inequality. That's different to choice. So, to show you how crazy this has gone, I'm going to quote from the Feminist Manifesto that was written by Jennifer Bogarden. Feminism is something individual to each feminist. So to think how crazy this is, let's imagine we were to say the labour movement is something individual to each worker. How much then would we have of a labour movement? So I actually like working for $5 an hour, and who are you to tell me that I don't like it? Or imagine this, the civil rights movement is something individual to every person of colour. So I actually like racism, and who are you to take away my empowerment as a person of colour? Now, how did we get from liberation to individual empowerment in just one generation? Now, I could go on all day, but I can't. I've only got 20 minutes. So I'm going to pick a number of people I blame. I blame lots of people, but I'm just going to focus on who I blame specifically. Right. So, of course, these two who did mainstream neoliberal discourse, Louis Althusser, who, by the way, stabbed his wife to death. Yes, did people know that? Yes, he stabbed his wife to death. And when he talks about ideology, I'm going to explain later how the Althusserian move towards ideology away from economics was one of the things that put the nail in the coffin of radical feminism. I blame Judith Butler. There is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. She argues that gender is performance. So my question to you women would be, is if you perform masculinity, will your wages go up? No, probably not. I blame Camille Paglia, who said if civilization had been left in female hands, we would still be living in grass huts. So, I mean, there's many more people I'd like to blame, but I don't have the time. So let's add together mainstream neoliberal discourse, postmodernism, post-structuralism, and the move from women's studies to gender studies, where you eradicate women. And what you have is basically the destruction of Marxist insights, which has then destroyed, I would argue, feminism. So let's get to some of the core things that Marx said that were then taken into radical feminism. So Marx wrote, in the social production of their lives, men, and we're hoping he meant women here as well, enter relations that are specifically necessary and independent of the will. The totality of these relations of production form the economic structure of society, the real basis from which rises a legal and political superstructure. The mode of production of material life, this is the economic structure we live in, conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process generally. Key, the base superstructure argument. Ideology is not free-floating. Identity is not free-floating. It is anchored in an economic system that at its core, as we've just heard, is corrupt, unequal, and about the enslavement of people who are not part of the elite system. Now, Marx also went on to say men, and again, I hope he meant women here, make their own history. But they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. This, and I hate to use this academic term, but this problematicizes the concept of consent. You can't use the word consent without understanding the role that ideology plays. And God help anyone at a women's studies conference who mentions false class consciousness or false gender consciousness, as if it doesn't exist. It's ludicrous. Of course, when the elite control the media and the education system, we're all going to have on some level false consciousness, unless, of course, we've been taught to see through the system and as it works. But God forbid you mention that, because then you become what is known as an essentialist, which is a crime worse than death, by the way, right, actually deserving of death. Now, let's go back to what was said here again. Do you see now how the historic system of male dominance, a system committed to the maintenance and reinforcement of hegemony, these are Marxist concepts writ large in radical feminism, because as a structural view, you are born into a system that is bigger, more powerful, and basically conditions your life. And unless you understand that in terms of gender, then you end up with a kind of liberal or worse neoliberal feminism. The core of radical feminism is that women exist as a class. And as Andrea Dworkin said, the fate of every individual woman, no matter what her politics, character, values, quality, is tied to the fate of all women, whether she likes it or not. So let's think about empowerment versus liberation. When I joined the feminist movement, we never heard of the word empowerment. Why? Because that's an individual concept. I'm doing very nicely, thank you very much, with my white skin and nice education and my nice job. I'm so empowered, I actually do not know what to do with all of my empowerment, right? However, that does not change the reality of the lives of the women and men who are going to come in and clean up when we leave. My empowerment does not change the conditions of their existence. That's what radical feminism said, which is why you have to tie yourself and measure the success of feminism to the least elite, not the most. And now we have a type of feminism that basically measures how well we're doing by looking at the elite women. Now, today's battleground is between radical feminism versus liberal feminism and neoliberal feminism. So to give you a quick example, let's take the pie, right? This beautiful looking, I think it's strawberry rhubarb pie. So, what do the liberal feminists want? They want half the pie. Notice, by the way, how unappetizing it looks when you cut it in half, right? Now, I don't want to trash liberal feminism completely, because my life and many of our lives are much better because of it. It's just the lives of working class women and women of colour are not that much better from it. But I am here because of liberal feminism, there's no question. So the argument is, this is what liberal feminists want. They say, you know what, men have had all the pie, it's about time we got half the pie. The neoliberal feminists are happy with the crumbs. Right? This is what they want. The crumbs, and they are on their knees thanking the patriarchy for the crumbs. Now, what do radical feminists want? Right? The pie is so poisoned at its core that none of us want to eat from it. Right? Get rid of the lot. I don't want 50% of capitalism, patriarchy, globalization, all of that. Get rid of it and start again. That was the key insight of that. Okay, so now the battleground. How does neoliberalism versus radical feminism come into mainstream feminism? And let's look at two things, porn and so-called sex work. So in the radical feminist view, and these are some of the books, let's look what pornography is. As Andrea Dworkin so elegantly put it, think about pornography as a new institution of social control, a democratic use of terrorism against all women, a way of saying to every woman, look down, bitch, because when you look up, you're going to see your legs spread. That's what pornography was understood, collective terrorism against women as a class. Now, today, porn is actually to be celebrated. This is a book that came out recently, and this is the review. The feminist porn book identifies the importance of pornography as a form of expression and labour in which women and other minorities produce power and pleasure. Now, what's missing from this analysis is the fact that these women are the poorest, most exploited, women often with histories of sexual abuse and are spat out by the porn industry within 3 months, often to get onto a bus to the brothels of Nevada with the clothes on their back if they're lucky. But no, this is actually an expression of labour in which women and other minorities produce power and pleasure. Yeah, they produce lots of power and pleasure, but not for women, for men. So suddenly we have a feminism that's all about men, and suddenly women have disappeared. Now, when I wrote my book, Pornland, the worst review it got was in Ms. Magazine. So what was really interesting, it was reviewed by a third-wave feminist called Shira Tarrant. And she went to town on me, let me tell you. But the most interesting thing is in Pornland, I look at pornography from a Marxist political economy perspective. I look at it as an industry, I look at it in terms of production, consumption, all the things that we need to look at. So what did she do? She basically, when I talked specifically about how women in porn are within a system not of their own making, are there because of poverty, she then interviews one porn performer who's on the job. So this is like me asking a Walmart associate, do you like your job? As his manager's got his hand around him. He said, yes, of course, I love my job at Walmart. I'm here because I just like to hang out, you know, nothing to do with money, right? So they ask, and then the porn performer, who has got no choice, said, there is no doubt it's a very physical job. However, it is also a very individual profession. A performer always has the choice of not doing something they're not comfortable with. Complete lie. You actually have no choice. You get thrown out of the industry. You get forced into it. You get raped into it. We know when we speak to women who've been in porn that this is a complete lie. But the most interesting thing is I write a book about pornography as a system of inequality, as embedded in a system of inequality, and what do I get to fight back? One person's voice that trumps a whole entire political analysis. That's what it means when we talk about individualism. Right? You don't have structure anymore. Every individual's view is equal to the next. Well, actually, it's not true. It doesn't work like that because we all live in a society not of our own making. So it's all about individual choice of individual performer. But what's missing when you look at pornography is a structural understanding of porn as an industry woven into global capitalism. And the pornographers get that because when you interview pornographers like Andrew Edmond, he's not talking about fun and fantasy. He says, a lot of people get distracted from the business model by the sex. Porn is just as sophisticated and multi-layered as any other marketplace. We operate just like any other Fortune 500 company. The pornographers know that. It's just a bunch of academics who seem to be clueless about what's really going on in pornography. Now let's talk about sex work versus prostituted women. Sex work focuses on the women, decontextualized from the economic, political and legal context of the buying of sexual exploitation. You do not buy sex. As Rachel Moran says in her book, you buy access to sexual exploitation. It's a very different thing. Prostituted women, when you say prostituted women are not sex work, then suddenly you have to talk about an economic system that commodifies humans. You have to bring in patriarchy that makes women and children the most obvious group to commodify and monetize. You have to bring in racism that makes women of color the obvious, most likely group of women to commodify. And then, of course, we have to have who we never talk about, which is the pimp and the John. Men, when we talk about sex work, it looks like cars are buying women. Where'd you see a man? It's just a bunch of cars buying women. Well, let's put the men back. These were a bunch of Johns who recently got arrested, so you can just look at their faces. Let's talk about a John, right? Let's talk about a trafficker who never got really arrested. Well, he got arrested, but he got away with it. Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who ran the IMF, right? Do you know why women are fucked? Because men like him control the world, okay? He's a trafficker, he's a rapist, he's a John, all of those things. And you know what? This is the woman that he raped, amongst others. And by the way, right, what happened is, of course, it all went away. Cyrus Vance let it all go away because he was married to the rich, because Dominique Strauss-Kahn was married to one of the richest women in France. And so, of course, they paid off the first, basically, Miss Diafo, because She was poor, she was first generation, she was a maid in the Sofitel Hotel, right? Single mother, I'm sure she was absolutely paid off. But where were the feminists outside saying, don't let Dominique Strauss-Kahn get away with it? You know where the feminists were that summer? Organising slut marches. Right? So what would have happened to her if she would have gone on a slut march? Well, this was the New York Post. Of course she's going to be a hooker. She's black, for God's sake. Isn't that enough evidence? What more do you need? The fact that her blood and his semen were up the bathroom walls of the Sofitel Hotel didn't seem to make any difference. She was just a hooker. So the question is, okay, what is feminism? So let's go back to the political theory and practice to free all women, women of colour, working class women, poor women, physically challenged women, lesbians, older women, as well also as white, economically privileged heterosexual women. Anything less than that is not feminism. That's liberation. That's not empowerment. So what do we do? How do we do this? Well, I like to take Gramsci's argument, pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. Always optimism of the will. We can change this, because if you don't believe that, then you do the work of the devil, let me tell you. If you think we've lost all of this, you do the work of the enemy. So you have to have faith, but never, ever have a starry-eyed view that it's just going to happen tomorrow. But the optimism of the will is the belief that it can happen. And you know why it can happen? Because it happens because of women power. We have been the leaders of every single major movement that made this world livable. And then, of course, when it becomes a movement, women end up doing all the coffee and everything else, and the men take over. So let's just be very clear about this. Women have moved this world. We have made it livable. We have made it a world worth living in, and we have that power to change it. Thank you.